Why China's housing crash will be worse than expected. In the past decade, China has experienced an unprecedented housing boom. But now, that boom is turning to bust, and the crash is shaping up to be far worse than anyone expects. There are a number of reasons why China's housing market is particularly vulnerable to a sharp downturn. For one thing, prices have soared to astronomically high levels in many Chinese cities, leaving buyers with very little room for error. What's more, a large portion of the country's housing wealth is owned by speculators who are likely to dump their properties at the first sign of trouble, exacerbating any price declines. But perhaps the most important reason why China's housing crash will be worse than expected is that the country's economy is now highly dependent on the property sector. The current situation, what is happening in the Chinese housing market now? The current situation in the Chinese housing market is dire. Prices have been falling for months, and there is no end in sight. The Chinese government has been trying to prop up the market by buying apartments and investing in infrastructure, but so far these efforts have been unsuccessful. If the housing market continues to decline, it could have a ripple effect throughout the Chinese economy, leading to a sharp slowdown. The Chinese housing market is in dire straits. Prices have been falling for months, and there is no end in sight. The current situation is far worse than anyone could have predicted, and it is having a major impact on the economy. The housing market crash is just one symptom of the larger problems facing the Chinese economy. The country is in the midst of a major slowdown, and this is causing serious problems for businesses and consumers alike. The housing market crash is just one example of how the slowdown is affecting ordinary people. The Chinese government has been trying to prop up the economy with stimulus measures, but so far these have not been very effective. The country's leaders are under immense pressure to turn things around, but it is not clear how they will be able to do so. The root of the problem, what are the underlying causes of the housing crash? The housing market in China has been on a hot streak for the past few years. However, many analysts believe that a crash is inevitable and that it will be far worse than anyone could imagine. There are numerous factors that contribute to this belief. For one, the Chinese economy is highly leveraged, which means that any slowdown could cause a domino effect. Secondly, the Chinese government has been propping up the housing market with subsidies and other measures, but those cannot last forever. And finally, there is an oversupply of housing in many parts of China, which will only add to the downward pressure on prices when the market does turn. The potential consequences of a housing crash in China are very serious. It could trigger a banking crisis, stall economic growth, and even lead to social unrest. The implications, what are the potential consequences of the crash? In recent years, China has been one of the world's fastest growing economies. However, there are now signs that the country is heading for a housing market crash, which could have far-reaching implications. There are several reasons why China's housing market is at risk of a crash. Firstly, prices have been rising at an unsustainable rate in many major cities. This has led to growing concerns about a bubble, particularly as affordability levels have become increasingly stretched. Secondly, there is mounting evidence of overbuilding in the country. The way forward, what can be done to mitigate the effects of the crash? In a country with over 1 billion people, it's no surprise that China's economy has been booming in recent years. However, with this growth comes the inevitable bust, and experts are predicting that China's housing market is on the verge of a crash. So what can be done to mitigate the effects of the crash? For one, the government could provide financial assistance to those who are struggling to keep up with their mortgage payments. Additionally, banks could be encouraged to offer more flexible repayment terms for loans. Of course, it's not just the financial sector that will be affected by a housing market crash. Construction companies and other businesses that rely on the housing market will also suffer. The government will need to come up with a plan to help these businesses weather the storm. Ultimately, it remains to be seen how severe China's housing market crash will be. Here we come to conclusion. Please do subscribe our Nonsense YouTube channel for more videos, if you have not done already. The Chinese housing market is in a bubble that is about to burst. This will have catastrophic consequences for the Chinese economy and will send shockwaves around the world. The Chinese government is in denial about the extent of the problem and is doing nothing to address it. The housing market in China has been booming for the past few years, but it is now showing signs of serious trouble. Prices have been rising at an unsustainable rate, and there are now more vacant properties than there are people looking to buy them. The Chinese government has been pumping money into the housing market in an attempt to keep prices high, but this is only delaying the inevitable crash. When the housing market does finally crash, it is likely to be far worse than anything we have seen before.